I'm Dale Halling, and in this video we're going to be discussing praxeology. Ludwig von Mises was one of the foremost economists of the Austrian School of Economics, and one of his major contributions was praxeology, which is the study of human action, or the science of human action, according to Mises. Now, the Austrian School of Economics is sort of split in two on this issue. There are those who follow Mises's praxeology and those who follow Hayek's cultural evolution ideas. Ludwig von Mises laid out his ideas in his book on praxeology, in his book Human Action. Before I begin discussing praxeology, I want to give you a short introduction to Austrian economics. Its founder was Karl Menger, and it differed from classical economics, which was defined by such people as Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus, mainly in its idea of the subjective theory of value and prices, but also because it added the idea of marginal utility. Now, in classical economics, the value and price of an item or good was related to the amount of labor that was put into it, and that is an intrinsic theory of value. The Austrian theory is a subjective theory of value, and it is that each person individually determines the value. Marginal utility is the idea that you rank order goods as you get them, and in other words, the more of them you have, the lower utility you will use them for. So with our 3 buckets of water here, the first bucket of water you'll use as drinking water. If you obtain a second bucket of water, you will use it, for instance, to water your garden. And if you obtain a third bucket of water, you might use it to bathe. Now, if tomorrow you obtain just 2 buckets of water, you will not bathe and water your garden. You will start with your highest priority, which is drinking water, and then watering your garden, and you'll forego bathing. I reviewed numerous papers and video lectures as part of making this video. Many of them ramble on, and they tend to spend more time attacking things such as logical positivism than explaining what praxeology is. I admit that I did not read Human Action. I have tried to read some of von Mises's books before and found them extremely boring. I did select 2 of these, one a paper and one a video, as best representing the ideas of praxeology and also getting to the point. One of them is this paper from the Mises Institute, Praxeology, the Method of Austrian Economics. Another is a video by Dr. Walter Brock. The fundamental axiom of praxeology is that individual human beings act, and they act consciously towards chosen goals. However, they note that praxeology does not evaluate anything about whether the goals make sense or are proper or wise. So how can you tell the difference between a non-goal directed action and a goal directed action if you cannot say what goals should be pursued or will be pursued? If the goals are random or allowed to be random, how can you be sure the actions are not random? The answer is that there's no difference between non-goal directed action and goal directed action where the goals are random. This is part of the value subjectivism of Austrian economics. And what is the goal of directed action of a person committing suicide, or a vandal, or a teenager on a joyride? The human action axiom, this fundamental axiom we're discussing, is meaningless when it is impossible to judge the goal. Now, the paper then goes on to state that the conclusions of praxeology cannot be tested by historical or statistical means. In fact, there's no need to test them because their truth has already been established. And they say that the only reason to look at them in historical cases is to decide which theory is applicable in any particular case. This means that praxeology is a branch of philosophical rationalism. Descartes created a system of physics by just thinking about the world. It was internally consistent. In other words, it was just like praxeology, and it did not describe the world and could not be used to predict or understand how the world worked. The paper goes on to make this point that mathematical logic works for physics, but not in economics. And then it talks about axioms in physics. There are no axioms in physics. Physics is a science, and science starts with observations, not axioms. So the paper goes on to state that the Austrian School of Economics rests firmly on the idea, the beginning of analysis, is the fact of individual subjective values and choices. Now, when they say subjective, they are not saying that each person just decides for themselves. They're saying that each individual decision is disconnected from reality. Ayn Rand has a very interesting discussion of this issue in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. She discusses the difference between intrinsic, subjective, and objective theories of value and, in economics, prices. Now, if you remember, classical economics had an intrinsic theory of value and prices, and that intrinsic theory was based on the labor that went into developing a product or device. Now, the subjective theory of value says that each individual gets to decide, totally separate from reality, how much value they place on certain things. An objective theory of value is one that takes both the situation of the valuer and the thing being valued into account. Modern economics has adopted the Austrian ideas of subjective theory of value. So where does this subjectivism come from in Austrian economics? Well, in the Hayek branch, it comes from Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment. The whole Scottish Enlightenment was based around the idea that ethics is based on emotions. And these emotions are subjective. They're not objective. They're not based in reality. And you can't evaluate them. They are what they are. And from the Mises Menger side of Austrian economics, they come from Franz Brentano. And he also said that ethics is based on emotion. So now I'm going to turn to the video on praxeology by Dr. Bloch, who appears to be a well-known Austrian economist. And he states, economics is pure logic. There's no need to verify it in the real world. Well, that's not a science. That's mathematics or logic. And he also goes on to say, well, economics is based on pure logic. He argues it's a science. Well, no, that's not what a science is. A science is something that empirically verifies its theories. It is not just a system of logic. It's amazing that a professor at a major university could miss such an obvious point. Now, my points on this video, the praxeology video, are mainly taken from the first 15 minutes. I reviewed the whole lecture, but the important points come early on. According to the video, the total profits in the economy equals zero, and that's an axiom or a theorem of praxeology. Now, if this was true, we would still be living in the Malthusian trap. The definition of zero profit in the economy would mean that on average people are living on the edge of starvation. Profit means that you produce enough to have a surplus. But this does not have to bother Dr. Bloch, because economics is not an empirical science, according to him. Of course, that's an oxymoronic statement. It appears the professor was attempting to summarize the zero profit theorem, which is based on perfect competition. Perfect competition is a flawed concept that denies property rights, something that it has in common with Austrian economics. I discussed the many flaws of perfect competition in my books, The Source of Economic Growth, and also in my lecture at the Atlas Summit 2015. If what the Austrians are trying to say is that in a technologically stagnant economy the total profits tend to zero, then that is true, and I discuss this in my book. The reason for this is the second law of thermodynamics, often stated as just entropy. It is also probably true in a technologically stagnant market, profits tend to zero for the firms in that market. Dr. Bloch attempts to justify the fact that the zero profit theorem does not need to be tested by the idea that, or the statement that you don't test that a triangle has 180 degrees. But of course, yes, you do. Obviously, Dr. Bloch is not familiar with the book Flatland. In fact, there's an experiment in astronomy right now that is doing exactly this. Now, the next statement is that trade, that both parties expect to profit from trade, is an axiom or theorem of praxeology. This is definitely true. However, it seems clear that it violates the zero profit tendency. Now, according to the video, the only inputs to the economy are land, labor, capital, and then entrepreneurs. Land, labor, and capital are the standard inputs that most of economics talks about. Entrepreneurs are something new. But how are entrepreneurs a separate input? Are not entrepreneurs just a combination of people and capital, at least in Austrian economics? The additional input, and the only input of importance, is human knowledge. And when we're talking about economics, that means inventions. I've only commented on the first 15 minutes or so of the video. There were other errors, but explaining them would take too long. Of course, there were many valid points. The bottom line is that praxeology is not a science, and to the extent Austrian economics is based on praxeology, it is not a science. Dr. Bloch points out that there are two schools of Austrian economics, and the other one is based on Hayek's ideas. Hayek rejected praxeology, and a somewhat equivalent theory is his theory of cultural evolution. I discussed this in this video. Cultural evolution is an inherently collectivist idea that is based on the idea that reason is limited or totally ineffectual. It's not a science either, since it rejects reason. So your answer might be, so what? So the Austrians got some fundamental problems wrong. Perhaps they're right on all economic points thereafter. But they aren't. These problems result in other problems. For instance, their whole conception of property rights is confused. In fact, they don't really believe in property rights. They believe in property privileges. They think that property privileges are socially useful tools for allocating scarce resources. And this leads to other mistakes. It means that they're completely against the idea of patents, and they don't understand that patents are property rights. In fact, property rights are based on creation. They're not just socially useful tools. And this causes them to reject all intellectual property rights. Their subjective theory of value and prices causes all sorts of problems. It, for instance, rejects the whole idea of natural rights. Their rejection of natural rights not only undermines the whole theory of rights and an objective theory of law, it undermines any objective basis for economics. The subjective theory of value and prices turns economics into nothing more than a game. Also, their refusal to use empirical methods means that they confuse things, such as fractional reserve banking, central banks, and legal tender. I discuss these in more detail in this blog post. But fractional reserve banking is a natural part of the free market. Central banks are not, and neither are legal tender laws, but Austrians tend to conflate all three of these. It also is consistent with the libertarian defense of liberty. And that defense is that liberty is based on the limits of reason. That is inconsistent with the founding of the U.S., it's inconsistent with objectivism, and it's a complete disaster. It's not surprising that so many religious people are attracted to Austrian economics. I reviewed numerous papers and video lectures as part of making this video. Many of them ramble on, and they tend to spend more time attacking things such as logical positivism than explaining what praxeology is. I admit that I did not read Human Action. I have tried to read some of von Mises's books before and found them extremely boring. I did select two of these, one a paper and one a video, as best representing the ideas of praxeology and also getting to the point. One of them is this paper from the Mises Institute, Praxeology. So I also present some of these solutions in two video lectures. One of them was my video lecture at Atlas Summit 2015 entitled The Source of Economic Growth. The other one was in my Atlas Summit 2014 lecture entitled Why John Galt is an Inventor. I've also written another nonfiction book. It's entitled The Decline and Fall of the American Entrepreneur, How Little Known Laws and Regulations Are Killing Innovation. This book discusses how we had economic growth in the late 1990s that was killed in the first decade of the new century, when in fact, to most people, the policies between the late 1990s and the 2000s appeared to be exactly the same. The paper goes on to make this point that mathematical logic works for physics, but not in economics. And then it talks about axioms in physics. There are no axioms in physics. Physics is a science, and science starts with observations, not axioms.